Hello, church family. As I'm sure you know, we have a pretty big election coming up next month in our country. And so for our devotions this week, I want to address one of the most important moral issues being discussed in politics right now. I'm calling this series Fearfully and Wonderfully Made. That phrase comes from Psalm 139 and verse 14. This week we're going to be doing a study of verses 13 through 18 in this Psalm of David. Today we'll start with verse 13. But first, let me give you some context. This psalm can be divided into 4 sections, with 6 verses in each one. Verses 1 through 6 focus on God's exhaustive knowledge, and verses 7 through 12 emphasize his inescapable presence. In other words, God is both omniscient and omnipresent. He knows us completely and is with us wherever we go. Then in verses 13 through 18, we find out when God's presence begins to be with us. It's at the very beginning of our lives. Listen to what David said to God in verse 13. For it was you who created my inward parts. You knit me together in my mother's womb. David clearly stated here that God brought him into existence. He's the one who created our inward parts. The Hebrew word translated inward parts normally just refers to the kidneys, but sometimes it's used metaphorically as a reference to our inner person. The New International Version has the phrase inmost being here, and I think this is on the right track. In other words, David probably wasn't talking about the organs inside our body. Instead, he was referring to the immaterial part of a person. We see a similar statement in Zechariah chapter 12 and verse 1, which says that God stretched out the heavens, laid the foundation of the earth, and formed the spirit of man within him. So David acknowledged that God created our inner person. And then he said that God knit us together in our mother's womb. I remember learning how to knit when I was a kid. I was never very good at it, but I think it's fascinating to watch an expert knitter. What they do is use needles to interlace yarn in a series of connected loops. And after a while, those loops turn into a blanket or a piece of clothing. That's a beautiful picture of how God creates the parts of our body and joins them together as a unified whole. Listen to what Job said to God in Job chapter 10 and verse 11. You clothed me with skin and flesh, and wove or knit me together with bones and tendons. But in Psalm 139 and verse 13, David didn't seem to be talking about the parts of our body. Instead, his focus was probably on how God knit the material and immaterial aspects of our being together. He created us in such a way that our body informs our spirit, and our spirit affects our body. This is really incredible when you pause to think about it. We have an invisible mind, but our thoughts are processed through our brain. Our spirits can experience grief, which sometimes results in tears. When we're afraid, that feeling can be expressed physically through trembling. When we experience joy, our body sometimes responds with laughter. The intertwining of our body and our spirit is a reflection of God's marvelous handiwork. In verse 13, David concluded by talking about where God knits us together in our mother's womb. This is the place where our lives begin. And Psalm 51 and verse 5 traces our personhood all the way back to conception. There, David said, I was sinful when my mother conceived me. Therefore, to kill a baby in the womb is murder, plain and simple. Abortion is a terrible evil, and yet it's currently legal everywhere in our country. This election is an opportunity for us to steer our country toward obedience to God's moral law in this area. Abortion is certainly not the only political issue on the table, but it's definitely one of the most important. I want to encourage you to take advantage of the privilege we have in our country to vote. And when you do that, make sure that your vote goes to people who want to protect life in the womb. Let's remember that our mother's womb was the place where God created us and knit us together.